everyone. Thank you, and welcome to yet another interesting and historical moment in Grenada's history, moving towards our 50th anniversary of independence. Today, we have the CARICOM panel unveiling of a Roundabout. So we welcome you here, and we hope that this evening's session will be a very interesting one for all of us. And those of us here present, we are part of history. And those who are viewing online, we welcome you and take in as much as you can. So at this point, I'd like to invite to the microphone Mr. John Telesford, the acting principal of the T. Marshall Community College, to make some opening remarks. Let's put hands together for him.
Pleasant good afternoon to panelists, audience. This is my second day on the job, and actually my first official address to the public. So we at TAMCC, we are pleased as the indigenous tertiary and post-secondary institution in Grenada to host this auspicious panel discussion as we move boldly towards our 50th anniversary of independence. Although there are many debates on the question of independence, one reality is that on the 7th February 1974, Grenada hoisted its own flag, embraced its own constitution, which marked the severing of our colonial umbilical cord. On this journey of independence, the TAMCC is delighted to bring into our noble walls these esteemed experts to discuss and share on the Unveiling Unity CARICOM Roundabout panel. We are sure that academic institutions, and especially our locally grown one, which was born post-independence, has a lot to offer on this independence debate and journey. We are pleased to be to have our own chair, Dr. Grenade, being a part of the panel, and I guess maybe she's representing as an expert, maybe not TAMCC, but I'm also certain that our other panelists, Dr. Jacob, Mr. Moses, have also interacted with TAMCC in many ways, and we're happy to invite you into our institution. We look forward with great anticipation to their sharing on the profound significance of CARICOM from Grenada's unique perspective. In fact, the man, T.A. Marshall, after whom our college is named, is also commemorated here today for his visionary efforts in laying the foundation for CARICOM. Therefore, to our celebration committee headed by Dr. Crawford and your team who organized this panel, our audience, students in particular, the media, and other well-wishers, persons online, I think it's being streamed, we extend a warm welcome. I encourage you to listen and participate in what I anticipate would be a stimulating and rewarding exercise. Once again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Telesford, for your words of welcome. And well done on your achievement on the second day of your job as principal of TAMCC. And now we'll move straight into the next remark by Dr. Wendy Crawford, our exciting head of the local organizing committee for our 50th anniversary of independence. Let's give her a nice welcome, please.
The minister is here. Could you bring the minister to his seat, please? Thank you. Welcome, Minister Ander. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. I am particularly pleased to see the students who are here. I mean, my heart is glowing. So thank you for coming. Esteemed panelists, Mr. Moderator, other attendees, welcome. I promise you a very, very productive, informative, and educational session today. We are going to be looking reflections on our CARICOM journey, and I have no doubt that when you leave here, you will get lots of information from our very knowledgeable panel. We promise an exciting and entertaining. So keep your questions for the panelists. We're definitely going to have a period when you can engage and ask questions. I just want to, on behalf of the National Organizing Committee for our 50th anniversary of independence, and the Independence Secretariat to welcome you to this session. My role here is very brief, and that's all I want to say. And just to say that we thought that this was a very important event in the sense that Grenada has always had a strong commitment to regional unity, and that we have played a major part in regional integration even before Marisho, which maybe you might hear a little more about, but definitely we have always played a major part in regional integration, and we think it is important that we understand the journey that we have traveled from the early integration movement to the establishment of CARICOM. We are hoping that this session is the beginning of a series of engagement that we will have as we contemplate the establishment of a symbolic establishment for the existence of CARICOM, which I'm sure you'll hear more about from our minister in his brief remarks. So on behalf again of the National Organizing Committee, we thank you for being here, and I'll leave the rest to the panelists. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wendy Crawford, for your welcoming remarks on behalf of the committee. And we're happy to have with us our Minister for Foreign Affairs, Trade and Export Development, Honorable Joseph Ander. Thank you for joining us here today, and we invite you now to make some opening remarks. Thank you. Let's welcome him, please.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Good afternoon to the head table, Ambassador Moses, Ambassador to CARICOM, Dr. Jacob, Dr. Grenade, Dr. Crawford, other distinguished members. I'm happy to see Mrs. Payne Banfield in the audience, an iconic Grenadian. Also my former student, Ms. Banfield. My constituent, Jaden, from St. Patrick, the beautiful, fresh faces of the secondary school students, other members of the National Independence 50th Anniversary Organizing Committee. Pleasant afternoon to all. I will not live down to the expectation of politicians that once we see Mike, we give long speech. It's a pleasure to be here to make these brief remarks this afternoon. CARICOM symbolizes everything good about the Caribbean and Caribbean civilization. We are small dots on the world map, but we punch, as a famous politician to the north said, bigly. And it is incumbent upon us to keep the flames of Caribbean unity alive, not only to honor the memories of those who have gone before us and have paved the way, but for the young ones for whom we ought to be shining examples. Our journey to this point has been a long and sometimes tortuous one. But I'm confident that we have the wherewithal, by way of human resource, to transform the Caribbean landscape for the good of all of our citizens. Sometimes we need to do symbolic things as a means of highlighting important junctures in our history and in our journey to transformation. And so I'm especially happy to see the young ones here, and I hope that you participate in the roundtable, in the discussion, that you ask questions, that you make your comments, that you let your presence be felt. I wish to commend the organizing committee for undertaking this venture, because it is important that we keep our citizens immersed in everything good that is going on among us, with us, by us, and for us. I'm going to keep to my pledge to be brief, and so I once again thank you for the opportunity for me to make these few remarks. I commend the committee for putting the event together, and I wish everyone fruitful deliberations for the duration of this forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your remarks. One people, one journey, one future, right? And that's what it's all about. As was mentioned by Dr. Crawford as well as Minister Joseph, that it's one journey we're on. Many persons have traveled through time and have experienced different things in our history. And that's what we're here today to celebrate, to recognize. The naming of a roundabout or any street or any building is just an indication of acknowledging that historical aspect of our lives as a people, as a Caribbean people. So today we are very much happy that we can come together and share and listen and learn a lot about who we are as a people as we move forward to our 50. So we have come to the meat of the matter here this afternoon, and that is the panelists sharing their insights on the many aspects of our history. We have a very esteemed panel with us this afternoon, and they're well versed in the areas that they're going to speak to us about. I will introduce them just before they speak, so I'll give their biography before, and they will choose to either sit at the table or come to the podium first in delivering their 10 minutes, and then you sit and take the questions from the table. Is that okay? All right. So we're going to start with the very first panelist, Dr. Wendy C. Grenade. Marisha first. Okay. Okay. So we'll start with Dr. Jacobs. He will speak to us on the role of Grenadian T.A. Marisha in shaping the early integration movement. And Dr. Jacobs holds degrees in history and political science from the University of the West Indies in 1983 and 2001. He wrote the first doctoral dissertation on Fedon's Rebellion in 2001 and has researched and written on Caribbean history and culture since 1996. So let's welcome Dr. Curtis Jacobs.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for being invited to participate in this event. To talk about T.A. Marisha. T.A. Marisha, 7th of November, 1887 to October 19th, 1958. I say those days, that's the dates of Marisha's birth and death. But T.A. Marisha is one of the pivots around which the modern contemporary history of Grenada turns. And incidentally, T.A. Marisha was born the same year as Marcus Garvey, but that's another story. Now, T.A. Marisha comes
the first time I have come across the name Marichaud, or Marichaud in Grenada's history, is the August 1795 Act of Attainder. This was a law passed by the British government at the height of Fidon's rebellion, and Pierre Marichaud was one of the persons or revolutionaries who were tainted with high treason in August of 1795. There's no evidence that he was actually captured, brought before the court of Oyer and Termine, and hanged and his body decapitated in Market Square. We have no record that that actually happened to him. But I make the point to say that the Marichaud name has been associated with the anti-slavery, anti-colonial movement since the 18th century. However, by the time T.A. Marichaud is born, the chattel slavery had been abolished since 1834, and by when he is born, the British government had changed what is called the ORS. Those of you doing Caribbean history or history, that's the O representative system, which is what looks basically like what our current parliament looks. Bicameral legislature, elected lower house, nominated upper house, the governor being in that case, the chief executive officer of the colony at the time, but now it's in a situation more or less analogous to the British monarch. And they had changed it now to what is called Crown Colony Government, which was all executive power is being held in the hands of the governor, and who is under directions from the British Colonial Office. And T.A. Marichaud was born into that political situation. And for us, he became under the tutelage of a chap called William Galway Donovan. And he learned all he could learn about newspaper publishing and politics from Donovan. And Donovan instilled in him several things, but for the purposes of this discussion, we want to deal with the issue of government and self-rule. And when he became old enough, he became the founder of, or one of the co-founders of the newspaper called the West Indian, with the masthead, the West Indies must be West Indian. And his life, we could say, was one of public service for his whole natural life. And his birth and his lifetime, his public career, has been basically what Grenada's political and constitutional movement towards what we know today. So, by 1925, when the British government reinstituted what is called the legislative principle, and we began to have representative government in that sense, people elected, T.A. Marichaud became the elected member of the town of St. George from 1925? No. Yes, 1925 until 1958, the day of his death. And that period, Marichaud was involved in all of Grenada's political goings-on, among other things. As a matter of interest, Marichaud was one of the founders of Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited, and and most of the people who were involved in the formation of Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited were associated with the anti-colonial, anti-slavery movement. So, in 1915, when Marichaud and C.F.P. Renwick, also called Jabneg in the modern folklore, they found the West Indian, where Renwick was the publisher and Marichaud was the managing editor. And as I said, they said the West Indies must be West Indian. Now, they began that movement towards, so by the time 1925, when the British restored the elective principle, he became Renwick as well too, but afterwards Renwick decided he was going to be a member of the Executive Council. That Executive Council is something not unlike the cabinet today. And Jabneg or CFP Renwick was involved. Those of you who live in St. Paul's, he used to own that place called the Tower along the road. Yeah, that was his residence. And so Marichaud was in the forefront all the time to be anti-colonial, the anti-colonial government. He was anti-colonial movement. He was involved in almost everything you could think about. But Marichaud was what you would call, he was very British. Always believed in the crown and all that very thing, except for one time. And that changes his life. Now, so in 1915, he helps organize the British part of the West Indies contingent to fight in World War I. And many of the local colonial intelligentsia believed that if they fought in the British army, the Britain would feel moved towards granting representative government afterwards. But it happened to a point. But the big date came in the year 1931, when the British Parliament passed an act called the Statute of Westminster. Now, that statute brought all what is called the white settler communities, all of their parliaments, which would be Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Those are what is called the white settler communities, where lots of European people lived, and the British thought that their institutions, parliament institutions, were good enough to be on par with the British Parliament itself. It meant that any law which was passed by that parliament, those parliaments, the colonial parliaments, were no longer subject to change or to disallowance by the British Parliament. Now, let's go back to Grenada. Now, Grenada's first elections as we know it today took place in the year 1766. But for these white settler communities, South Africa and particularly Australia, which was 1784, which was significantly after Britain had representative institutions in our part of the world, that for Marichaud was a slap in the face, because he thought that we who had practiced parliamentary democracy since 1766, if in the 1900s we supposed to be afforded that privilege as well. And after that, Marichaud turned almost completely away from Britain. He forbade his son even to go to fight in World War II and so on. Opposed militarism of any kind. And that influences his life for the rest of his life. So he did not like how the British treated what we were called now, because most of us were black living in this part of the world, we were called the tropical dependencies. And they did not grant that same privilege to us, even though we had parliamentary democracy long before those new boys, right? In what is called the Second British Empire. So, what happens? We know too that Marichaud was he didn't completely absorb that anti-British sentiment, because in 1943, with the death of CFP Renwick, the British invited Marichaud to join the Executive Council, the seat that CFP Renwick previously held until his death. And Marichaud took it. I don't know if there were pecuniary considerations with respect to that. There must have been. But Marichaud becomes a member of the Executive Council, which is like a inner cabinet who actually run things on a day-to-day basis in the colonial legislature. And to my great surprise, I would find Marichaud actually was considering accepting a knighthood. Serious business. Yes, I almost jumped out of my skin when I saw that doctor. I said, well, Marichaud knighthood? What are you talking about, right? But he never accepted it. So by the time Marichaud becomes, as he's waning, and the other big thing in Marichaud's political life was the appearance of Eric Gairy. And when Eric Gairy comes to the scene in 1951, Marichaud is eclipsed. Marichaud had been the star of Grenada's politics since 1925, or maybe even 1915. But when Gairy arrives in 1951, and Marichaud hangs on for dear life in the tongue of St. George's. When almost everybody else got covered over in the Gairy avalanche of 1951 or 1952, Marichaud barely survives. So he remains a member of the tongue of St. George until his actual death in 1958. So we have that, basically what Gairy was. Marichaud was what you might call the darling of Grenadian politics until he eventually died in 1958. Now, Marichaud, in my view, exerts a brooding presence on Grenada's politics. And he's not the only one, but most of you may not be quite aware. Maurice Bishop dies exactly 25 years to the day that T.A. Marichaud died. Exactly. October 1958, Marichaud dies. Maurice Bishop dies 19th of October, 1983. And other parts of Marichaud's life, like for 7th of November, his birthday, Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited, he's one of the founders, they opened their Grenville branch in the 1970s. But Marichaud, one of the three or four people who exerts a brooding presence even to this day over the history of Grenada. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs, for that inspiring presentation on T. Marichaud. I must say it was a very interesting journey, zooming into the political situation of our country at that time and the dynamics between the British and our own development in our politics. So thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs. I hope the students have questions that you'd like to ask later on. So please take notes so that you can ask your questions to clarify some of the things that we are hearing at this point. So I guess it's time to move to Dr. Wendy Grenade, right? No? I'm just using the list that I have here. Okay. So Mr. Aaron Moses, who will be doing economic integration, reflections, and prospects. Mr. Moses currently serves as Grenada's ambassador to CARICOM. He's a qualified management professional with consideration public, NGO, private, and sector experience serving at the parliamentary policy, leadership, and advocacy, ministerial levels in government, development, banking, manufacturing, and telecommunications. Mr. Moses has conducted policy reviews, strategic plans, program evaluation and assessments, and HR interventions for several private sector organizations, NGOs, regional and international organizations. He is also an experienced leader of the credit union movement, serving as a director and president of the Ariza Credit Union, president of the Grenada Cooperative Credit Union League, President of the Caribbean Conference of Credit Unions, and as a Director of the World Conference of Credit Unions. In addition, Mr. Moses served as the Vice President and President of the Grenada Athletic Association, President of the Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Deputy President of the Senate, a lecturer at the University of the West Indies Open Campus, Certificate in Management Program, and Policy Advisor to former Prime Minister Tillman Thomas. He earned a BSc in Management for the University of the West Indies and a MBA in Management from the University of Missouri and MSc in Telecommunication Regulations and Policy from the University of the West Indies. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Aaron Moses to present.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, students. It's my pleasure to join in this discourse. I'm particularly pleased to see so many TAMCC students on such a very important occasion. Sometimes I feel I've been quite privileged growing up in Grenada and attending the Grenada Boys Secondary School during the period of the conceptualization and operationalization of CARIFTA and CARICOM. Being the premier secondary school in Grenada at the time, we are fortunate in that there was a practice that a lot of visiting dignitaries paid visits to the Grenada Boys Secondary School. And in 1973-74, when I was a sixth form student, and for those of you who don't know, that is equivalent to TAMCC, I had the privilege of listening to Sir Alistair McIntyre, one of the outstanding Grenadian academics, who served as the Secretary General of CARICOM, also the Vice Chancellor of the UWI. He visited and lectured us as sixth form students. Subsequent to that, we had the visit of William Demas, one of the outstanding Caribbean economists, and he did a similar thing. And I think he managed to influence our sixth forms considerably. In my case, to the extent where I committed then never to leave Grenada. And so I never ventured outside of Grenada to work as a professional except consulting, because I was imbued with the CARICOM spirit, the spirit of community, and felt that I owed it to my country, to the Caribbean region, to remain. And so I am very heartened by the decision by the organizers to ensure that students at the TAMCC participate in discussions on issues that are germane to their survival and sustainability going forward, and hopefully to imbue within them the vision of being an active participant, not only in Grenada and in the Caribbean, but see yourselves as citizens of the world. And so to come to the subject I've been asked to talk about, regional integration, prospects, brief history and prospects. And I think to appreciate that, I want to locate the discussion in a brief history of the integration movement in the region that has its genesis in the emancipation of the slaves and the challenges that Britain had in managing our former colonies with significant numbers of enslaved people. The region no longer seen as economically important due to high cost and the lower cost of production in different parts of the world, serving as primary producers of primary commodities, feeding the industrial and post-industrial revolution in Europe. And so the issue was, how do I provide basic amenities? How do I provide services and manage these significant groups of people located on these islands out in the Caribbean? A number of things were tried, but I want to leapfrog to the point where it was contemplated by the British government to form a political union of the Caribbean of which 10 countries agreed. 4 other countries decided to have a look on the sidelines with the hope that it will morph into an independent region. So the region as a collaboration being managed centrally by a political structure. That failed, as you know, experiment which started in 1958 and ended in 1962 for a number of reasons. Some of it being insularity, some of it being structural, where there are problems with the constitution as proposed. But a lot of discussion and debates, people felt, well, there was no equity. For instance, at a point in time, Chaguaramas was chosen in Trinidad as the potential capital for the region. The Jamaicans were concerned, why not Kingston? Because they felt they were the largest country. Some audio problems. Jamaica at the time started producing bauxite, and the prospects of tremendous revenue looked very exciting. So they were worried about whether the LDCs, that is the OECS countries, would not be expensive appendages that they'll have to share the potential wealth with. So this insularity did play a significant role, but there were other reasons why the federation collapsed. So Jamaica had a referendum that people voted 54% to withdraw from the movement. And so Jamaica withdrew. And then Trinidad tried to hold it together, but frustration by Eric Williams, he made the grand announcement, as you know, he said, 1 from 10 leaves 0. And the movement collapsed. So both Jamaica and Trinidad became independent and left Barbados and the Windwards and Leeward Islands on their own. Attempts were made to pull it together, and they were known as the Little Eight. Barbados could not see the way forward again, being the most developed. You had similar sentiments, and they withdrew. And that left the Windwards and the Leeward Islands to fend for themselves. Of course, that might have been very positive because, you know, we now have the OECS, who I would argue is much more progressive than the wider, bigger regional movement. And so these are some of the origins of the integration movement. And policymakers and our academic thinkers at the time looking for solutions. How do we find a way out to ensure that we provide the means and goods and services to ensure that the population of the Caribbean people can be enhanced and growth can be achieved? And that was the challenges at the time. Many felt, and it was obvious then, that we could not do it alone. We were too small. And open economies. What do we mean by that, open economies? Essentially, we are intricately linked to the bigger world. We are not able to feed ourselves. Capital we could not generate, it came from outside. We utilized technology from outside. Our levels of productivity was low, high unemployment. So essentially, we lived being intimately linked to the external world. So we are open economies. That meant we are extremely vulnerable. In addition to vulnerability of climate, disasters, you know. So what were the options? So the conclusion was that we had to try to collaborate together, to pool our resources, to maximize the good things that we do, to ensure that we were not competing against each other. And that led to the birth of the first integration movement structurally, which is CARIFTA. That was formed with the initiative of Burnham of Barbados and Burnham of Guyana, and Barrow of Barbados. And they were joined by V.C. Byrd, the Prime Minister then of Antigua. And they formed, that was the genesis of CARIFTA, 1965. And that lasted until 1972. Many would argue whether, to what extent CARIFTA was successful. I think it was. If I can look at the trade data, trade imports and exports within the CARIFTA region multiplied, you know, it was 4 times during that period compared to pre-CARIFTA. So there was some measure of success. But there was a feeling that you needed to broaden CARICOM as well as broaden the scope of the regional movement. So that evolved and morphed into CARICOM that was formed in 1973. And you have, as you have known, last year the movement celebrated 50 years at Chaguaramas in Trinidad, where the original signing took place on the 4th of July in 1973. So that's a brief history of the integration movement. Now, the issue that many observers will raise, to what extent has CARICOM delivered on its mandate? Has it been successful? What are the primary objectives of CARICOM? There are 3 primary objectives. 1, regional integration and cooperation among the West Indian countries in the pursuance of the delivery of goods and services that are necessary to sustain our Caribbean peoples. Secondly, functional cooperation, where we collaborate on a range of things across the region. So we collaborate on health issues, we collaborate on education issues, we collaborate on financial issues. And the third major objective of the integration movement, as established by the Treaty of Chaguaramas, is joint collaboration on foreign policy, how we engage and treat with the external world. If we examine those 3 things, the extent to which we have been successful, I think there's general consensus that the greatest success that the region has had is in the area of functional cooperation. We have been able to collaborate and bring significant benefits to the region. And that is viewed by some of the institutions that we have been able to put together, institutions that continue to deliver services, goods and services to our people. So we're talking about institutions such as the Caribbean Development Bank that fund most of our development. And as you know, that bank is owned by all Caribbean countries, some regional institutions, countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, as well as Canada and Germany, France. They put funds into that institution, funds that we have access to fund the government capital development programs. Then we have UWI, and I don't need to explain to you the impact that UWI has on the region. Significant institutions, quite a few people in this room are graduates of UWI, have graduated a few 100,000 professionals across the region. It now has over 40,000 students. That places it in one of the large universities of the world. And they have continued to deliver. We have the CXE. Some of you, well, all of you, I think, now do CXEs. In my time, we did O-levels. In fact, when I graduated and started to teach, that was the first time CXE exams, you know, so I had to teach the CXE syllabus then. That has been a tremendous success. We now have the Regional Supreme Court. We now have an institution in health known as CAFA, and I don't know how many of you have been paying attention in the last 3 years to COVID. That was the regional institution that managed the COVID pandemic throughout the Caribbean, providing all the drugs and the monitoring, the testing, and the records, etc. It has been tremendously successful. Then we have CDEMA, the organization that treats with disaster recovery. So when there's a hurricane or other disasters, they have the capacity, the reach, and the network, and the resources to assist. And there are so many. I've crossed through that treat with standards. There are about 22 different regional institutions that have been created and continue to deliver goods and services. So in terms of functional cooperation, it has been extremely successful. In addition to those institutions, the ministerial organs of CARICOM meet regularly and they deliver on a number of things. And one of the most important activity that's done, it is known as the COTED, the Council of Trade and Economic Development. As a common market, one of the things we do is to ensure that we have common and external tariffs and the management of that process is extremely exhaustive. So for instance, in a economic union like we have as CARICOM, one of the things on our objectives is to ensure growth and development of trade, productivity, etc. So goods and services that are produced within the CARICOM region have free access within the region. So a good produced in Trinidad that qualifies do not pay duties coming into Grenada. So to develop our productive and trading capacity within the region, the mechanism that is used is that there is a tariff that is placed on extra-regional goods and services that are produced. So they do not unfairly compete with what is produced in the region. Because of our small size, we do not have the economies of scale that can produce at a lower cost. So you'll find in many cases, goods produced outside there will compete unfairly within our Caribbean. So to give our local production capacity a fillip, there are certain protections that's afforded. In additionally, a number of the developed countries, they subsidize significantly a lot of the industries, particularly in agriculture. And so we cannot compete fairly with these large countries. If you look at poultry, for instance, we may be producing 5,000 chicks, whatever a day. Outside there, you have one institution producing millions of chicks in a day. You cannot compete with, that economies of scale, where they have cheaper feed, cheaper energy, high levels of mechanization, etc. So that is one of the important functions of CARICOM, and that institution known as COTED that manages that process has a significant amount of work to do because we import thousands of different items. So from that perspective, the integration movement has been extremely successful. If you look at collaboration in terms of joint foreign policy, the level of success is not as high. But it's important to note that in occasions when it works extremely successfully. One example of that was years ago when we negotiated with the European Union, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries at the time, the first Lomé Convention. The leadership of the Caribbean and our use of a leverage where we stood together, we were able to extract a lot of more benefits and negotiate a lot more than we could. Unfortunately, on some occasions, some countries have bucked that process, subject to the pushes and, and influences of larger countries have gone in different routes. But I think many lessons have learned, but it seems that periodically this insularity and the tendency to go off on your own have bedeviled what we do in the Caribbean region. So that brings me to the point of what has been some of the failures of the region. Many argue that the major failure of the regional integration movement has been the decision-making process, where repeatedly our heads and our technicians go to meetings, we agree on things that are understood and we all agree are beneficial and good for the region, but when we get back home, nothing happens. The survival of the 5-year cycle of politics, plus influences by different interest groups, find their way in the decision-making process, and there are no follow-through. So CARICOM, as a regional integration movement, does not have any mechanisms for treating with bad behavior. And bad behavior is defined here as not following through with agreed decisions where you sit there and said, okay, that's best for us, we're going to go in this direction. And you struggle for years and months after to get things done. So that has been one of the main problems bedeviling the movement. I think, where do we go from here? I think there's been a recognition, and it's unfortunate that it happens only when external dictates pressure us and pushes us in our corner, we seem to recognize the real full benefits and potential of collaboration. And that happens in groups, in homes, where people have a tendency to go off on their own due to their own agendas, due to their own whatever, specific insights as the case may be. Recently, and that might be occasioned by the challenges that we now face in the world, the geopolitical changes, the wars, the economic challenges, COVID, that have forced a rethink and an appreciation of the need to collaborate together. So from my perspective, we're now seeing a different approach to the regional integration movement. Additionally, we have a new breed of leadership that are displaying more patriotic and regional affinity for the protection of what's West Indian. We're seeing a greater sense of community, a phrase that is borrowed from a former Secretary General, Roger Greenford. And so there's a rebirth, in my view, of the importance of CARICOM and what it can deliver. And an understanding as a vehicle, this is possibly our best policy choice, our best option for being able to deliver to the needs of our community, to enhance the lives and well-being of a community of Caribbean people. Challenges going forward, there are many. There are many. As a region, we have to become more competitive. To become more competitive, we have to be more insightful about what are our options, what are the things we try to do. Our education system, the need to focus on the sciences and mathematics, our levels of productivity, building capacity or resilience. We're still not at the point where we can make a significant greater impact on our ability to feed ourselves. We do have natural resources, very rich soils, but a lot of our estates and our soils are not productive. And so we still remain a very open dependent region, and we need to change those things. So as young students, you have to begin to see yourselves as world players. The ability to sit in Grenada and provide services wherever it is required because the mechanisms exist. So you have to focus on your education. You have to build your capacity. And it's only by doing so we can begin to make a significant impact on the challenges that we as small island Caribbean states are facing. I think I've said a lot, and I see Wendy shaking her head and asking me to shut up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moses, for your presentation. I think they wanted to hear more about CARICOM, because it's so interesting that the organization CARICOM is affecting our lives here in Grenada so much in health, in disaster management, in trade, and so forth. So there's so much more we can learn about CARICOM and Grenada's involvement. I was happy to hear that with regards to the challenges that we face with CARICOM at this point in time, particularly because the decisions are not binding most times, so the implementation of those decisions when leaders get back to their countries can be a challenge. And the question maybe later on we could ask is, what mechanisms can we put in place to address that particular challenge? Also, the whole issue of other political organizations and maybe groups having a voice at CARICOM as well and making their contribution towards many decisions that are being made consistently. So as we move on, we will hear more about that. And we move to Dr. Wendy Crawford, who will, Grenade, sorry, who will, there's so much Wendy's around, right? So much Dr. Wendy's. Who will sort of give us an overview of the two presentations along with herself. Grenada CARICOM journey, Reflections and Prospects. So Dr. Crawford, Dr. Grenade holds a PhD and MA in International Studies from the University of Miami with concentrations in comparative politics and international relations, and an MA in Human Resource Management from the University of Westminster, London. She is currently a professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, School of Arts and Sciences, St. George's University. Prior to joining SGU in August 2022, Professor Grenade was employed for 16 years with the University of the West Indies, Cayville campus, Barbados, as a lecturer and then senior lecturer in political science. At the UWI, she served as Deputy Dean, Outreach and Graduate Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, and Head, Department of Government, Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology, and as a coordinator of the Masters in Integration Studies program. Prior to joining the University of the West Indies, she taught as an adjunct professor at Florida Atlantic University and was also a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Miami, European Union Center. Her research interests include comparative regionalism, Caribbean politics, governance, democracy. Professor Grenade has anchored over 20 peer-reviewed articles and is the editor of the book Grenada Revolution, Reflections and Lessons, 2015, University Press of Mississippi, and co-editor of the Interdisciplinary Perspectives in COVID-19 and the Caribbean. She was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2023. In addition to her experience in the field of higher education, Professor Grenade was employed with the government of Grenada for 20 years in the Grenada Public Service and the Grenada Diplomatic Service, with hostings in Washington, D.C., London. She is currently the chair of the TMR Community College. Let's welcome Dr. Grenade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
To all of you. I must acknowledge the acting principal of the TMR Community College, Dr. John Tellisford, the dean of our School of Arts, Sciences, and Professional Studies, Mr. David Ambrose, and my colleague and friend, my namesake, Dr. Wendy Crawford. Fellow panelists, and I think we have online Mr. Ali Gill. Yes, and to all of you in the audience, my sister Gloria Payne Banfield, I know you could answer all the questions that they would be asking us this afternoon. Thank you for being here, and to the students. We are so happy that you could be here because it's very important. To other guests, to members of the media. We have started our journey of commemorating and celebrating Grenada at 50. I must first of all, though, pay tribute to founding leaders and the early pioneers who labored in the vineyard, seeking to build the Grenadian and Caribbean society. We heard Sir Alistair McIntyre. He was from Gove and was a pioneer. We heard about T.A. Marisho, and there were many others. We really stand on the shoulders of many persons, and we salute their memory because we are here in their name and seeking to advance an understanding of our Caribbean and our Grenadian selves. Now, as you heard earlier, and I want to commend my two fellow panelists who went before me, on 4th July last year, CARICOM celebrated 50 years as the oldest regional integration grouping in the developing world. That was an accomplishment for a very small region. But it is necessary to point out that regional integration in the Caribbean did not begin when the Treaty of Chaguaramas was signed in 1973. And I was saying to Dr. Curtis Jacobs, we could have a long discussion on the different arrangements that were put in place, whether imposed by Britain or otherwise, with the indigenous communities in the Caribbean as they search for ways to better become, ways to live better by integrating. So it has been a long historical journey. Similarly, next month here in Grenada on the 7th of February, we will celebrate 50 years of political independence under the theme, One People, One Journey, One Future. Now, if we define independence as a continuous search for freedom, then Grenada's independence journey really predated political independence on February 7th, 1974. Therefore, I think a long-range historical view, and this is what we've been hearing the other panelists bringing forth, a long-range historical view becomes very important for us to analyze and celebrate Grenada and CARICOM over the past 50 years. And there is a lot to celebrate as we think about this opportunity for what I like to call a great Grenadian and great Caribbean reset. It is an opportunity for celebration. And I think one of the shortcomings of us Grenadian and Caribbean people is that we do not sufficiently celebrate achievements along the way. But it is important to do so. For in celebrating, we discover and rediscover ourselves. And I want to commend the organizers for the renaming of the Roundabout, because there is something in regional integration studies called cognitive regionalism. And what is cognitive regionalism? It is where you internalize what regional cooperation means in terms of the benefits that it can bring to people. So when a little child from St. Paul's is coming to the Anglican High School and passes and sees that roundabout with all the flags and says, but mommy, what does this flag represent? And the mom says, you know, this is a flag for Antigua. And this is what it means. It is symbolic. And symbolism becomes very important for us to understand the meaningfulness of regionalism. So I want to commend the organizers, because we can't take it lightly that we would build monuments to claim a history that is our own. And in so doing, we help generations to come to see it as normal to wake up in the morning and see a CARICOM flag on the building in Tantine, which I hope every government building one day would be able to have the Grenada flag and the CARICOM flag, because in the symbolism, it becomes important for us to understand the meaning. So the theme, One People, One Journey, One Future, allows us to locate Grenada and CARICOM in what I call a complex web characterized by unity and diversity. That is, and we know that the Honorable Basio Pandey passed away today, and we honor his memory. So when I'm speaking about oneness and unity and diversity, despite ethnic, class, gender, ideological, political, and other differences, there is that impulse for unity, and Sir that Ramphal captures it so well every time he speaks about the impulse for unity that is most evident in moments of crises, and Aaron Moses just spoke about it. In moments of crises or on occasions that allow our Grenadian and our Caribbean pride to shine forth, we see that impulse, because there's the tendency to push and to pull. And what has occurred in CARICOM over 50 years is a push-pull model of integration, a model that I call a 4 Ps model. It is prime ministerial, it is paper-based, it is piecemeal, and it could be people-less. But there's a tendency where we see that pushing and that pulling, that unity in diversity. So I would combine an historical and comparative approach to understand the journey. Grenada in CARICOM, CARICOM in Grenada. And in case you have to leave, my 3 broad takeaways. 1, the Caribbean community is a summation of its unique and complex parts. Hence, Grenada's story has been shaped as it continues to shape the Caribbean whole. There is therefore an intricate relationship between Grenada's historical evolution over the past 50 years and CARICOM's trajectory over the last 50 years. Now, there's something called the national situation, and Aaron alluded to it. Whether we're speaking about ASEAN in Southeast Asia, Whether we're speaking about the African Union or the European Union, we saw Brexit recently. Whether we're speaking about NAFTA or the OECS or CARICOM, there is something called the national situation, where there is a nexus, the global, national, and local nexus, where there would be global forces and incentives for you to integrate and cooperate. And we see that in our foreign policy and the complexity with which we organize ourselves globally. In moments of crisis, whether we're thinking about climate change or otherwise, we see how we vote in the UN collectively. With solidarity for Cuba, we see how we vote collectively. And then we see on other occasions how more powerful countries could pull us apart. But it is important to understand that the national situation is a constant, whichever regional integration process we're trying to understand. So we want to know how Grenada's national situation has been shaped by its Caribbean identity, and how, in turn, Grenada's own specificities have helped to shape the evolution of CARICOM. So for the students in the audience, it would be a nice SBA question. How has Grenada influenced the journey of CARICOM, and how, in turn, CARICOM has helped the evolution of Grenada? Now, my second broad point, regional integration is as necessary as this is, and I've been saying this for the last 20 years. Regional integration is as necessary as it is problematic. And there is no ideal model or universal prescription that can be applied to all regionalization processes. Similarly, each sovereign state has to work through its own unique processes at defining and redefining nationhood. Yet regionalism is defined, if we define regionalism as collective resilience for collective sustainability. And for those of us who are small island developing states, Dr. Telesford, regionalism must mean collective resilience for collective sustainability. If that is how we are defining regionalism, then small sovereign states like Grenada must, by necessity, be part of a regional grouping for its own survivability and sustainability. So this is how we would want to problematize CARICOM and Grenada. The third broad takeaway, regional integration is not an end in itself. It has to be assessed in terms of its contribution to the overall well-being of the people of the region. People-centered regionalism promotes people-centered development. Similarly, political independence is meaningless as an end in itself. Why are we independent? What does independence mean? It has to be about advancing the total well-being of a people, of a nation. So if in the 1950s and 60s our grandparents lived a certain way, as time evolved, independence should be a continuous search for freedom that allowed people to break free from the unfreedoms of poverty and the unfreedoms of injustices, the unfreedom of gender inequality, and it should be a continuous search for greater degrees of freedom that would allow us to live better, to experience life better, to have greater access to opportunity for all. That being said, those are my broad takeaways. If we had to ask ourselves, what's one word that could link Grenada and CARICOM? I would say survivability. Survivability. Because a distinctive feature of the Caribbean is its survivability despite enormous challenges. Now, when we think about about CARICOM, we heard it was established in 1973. We know we had the Windward Islands Federation. We had before that the Leeward Islands Federation. We had the West Indies Federation and all of that. But in 1973, on the 4th of July, when the Treaty of Chaguaramas was signed, the Caribbean stood at the crossroads of what I call the intersection of the Meso-Federation, growing nationalism, and a hostile international environment. The Cold War was raging. Some of you are too young to even know anything about the Cold War. But back then, the Cold War was raging. Britain had just joined the European Community on the 1st of January 1973, and that became important. When you look at the 1972 communique from the CARICOM leaders, there was this concern about Britain joining the European Community and the umbilical cord being cut. Remember, only 4 CARICOM countries were independent at the time. Only 4: Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, Haiti was independent long before all of this happened. So the CARICOM, the CARICOM leaders were very concerned. What else was happening economically? You had a world convulsion in 1973, an energy crisis, and an oil shock that really devastated Caribbean economies. In fact, from 1976 to 1982, CARICOM heads of government did not meet. CARICOM heads of government did not meet from 1976 to, there was 6 years. There was no CARICOM heads of government meeting at all. And sometimes, you know, we celebrated 50 years last year, but it was the 45th conference of CARICOM. And somebody said, well, 5 years disappear. You know, CARICOM started on very rocky ground. In fact, at the 9th annual meeting of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank in April 1979, Dr. Curly King, then Secretary General of CARICOM, he reflected on the newly established community in this way. Remember, the treaty was signed in 1973, and he said, the ink was hardly dry on the signatures of the treaty when the full force of the international economic crisis struck the bottom out of everything we had ever hoped to accomplish. This was the Secretary General. But in a similar vein, the 1981 World Bank report said of the Caribbean, and I quote, "The past decade has been a difficult one for the nations of the Caribbean. Many are newly independent, and most are small islands with fragile economies. The problems of adjustment to being independent states in the world economy would have been immense, even if the world economy of the 1970s had been as stable as that of the 1960s. However, events since 1973, uncertain prices for the few primary products that they export, declines in earnings from tourism, dwindling foreign investment, higher energy costs, global recession, and hurricane-caused destruction have served to exacerbate the situation," end of quote. Now, this was a report of the World Bank in 1980. It sounded as if it was today, yes? I'm of the view that the conditions were right for CARICOM to be stillborn, starved of energy at birth. Yet it endured. The survival instinct of Caribbean people, our cultural and spiritual resilience, and our innate capacity to bounce back characterize our Caribbean community. Similarly, Grenada's survivability defines its independence journey. Grenada too experienced political, economic, and social crises in the 1970s. But that capacity to bounce back, that instinct to survive, is a Caribbean and Grenadian gift that we have given ourselves. And it comes from that tradition of overcoming. Yes? So let me move on to mapping a few footprints. And I've taken that word from Sister Gloria Payne Banfield. Grenada's footprints in CARICOM. Brother Curtis Jacobs spoke about T.A. Marishaw's role in agitating for the West Indies to be West Indian. And he had West Indian spelled as one word, West Indian, intentionally meaning becoming one. Grenada was a key member of the Windward Islands Federation, a key member of the West Indian Federation that lasted from 1958 to 62. And I usually don't like to say that it failed, because Eric Williams was a historian, you know. He was a mathematician. So when he said 1 from 10 left 0, 1 from 10 did leave 9. 1 from 10 did leave 9. And I always say, Eric Williams was no mathematician. Yes, 1 from 10 left 9. And that is why today we have such deep sub-regionalism in the OECS. So we've proven Eric Williams wrong. Every time we hold up an EC dollar, every time we look at our Eastern, we can clap to the OECS. Yes? Every time we think about our own Grenadian Dr. Timothy Antoine in the CCB, when we think about what's happening in all our institutions in the OECS, 1 from 10 did in fact leave more than 9. Grenada was a key member of CARIFTA, and we all could question Mrs. Payne Banfield about Expo 1969. It was a CARIFTA Expo here, a big trade fair. I wouldn't date myself, but perhaps it was one of my early memories. 1969 Expo. Grenada was very central to the Caribbean identity. Yes, and of course it was under Premier Eric Gary, very visionary in terms of an understanding of our West Indian selves. Grenada was the first of the smaller territories, and we heard about the Little Eight, to become independent. And it is important for us to say this, because Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana and Barbados became independent. And then we were all struggling whether we want unity state with Trinidad and Tobago and all of that. And Grenada got independence. So it meant then by 1974 we became a member of CARICOM. But it was not new territory for us. Because remember, we're building on Marishall's legacy. We're building on an understanding of our national identity as wrapped up in a West Indian identity. So we played a foundational role. We also played what I like to call a creative disruptive role. And in that creative disruptive role, the Grenada Revolution that occurred on March 13, 1979 became very instrumental. That was indeed the most significant period in the history of the Commonwealth Caribbean. And the world at that time was unfolding in a particular way. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. The Iranian Revolution had toppled the Shah. There was the issue with the US hostages in Iran. In this hemisphere, there were revolutionary upheavals in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And it was the 1970s, and what Brother Valentino refers to as the roaring 70s. At the 34th regular session of the United Nations General Assembly in October 1979, our Prime Minister Maurice Bishop delivered his inaugural address to the international community. Prime Minister Bishop emphasized Grenada's opposition to imperialism, colonization, neocolonization, apartheid, and racism. Prime Minister Bishop argued that small size must be explicitly recognized as a dimension of international relations, given the special disabilities experienced by small countries that weigh heavily in explaining the economic and social problems. He made a call for an oceans regime, Dr. Telesford, and a new international economic order, which would include the assertion of national sovereignty over the ownership and control of economic resources, and the creation of an equitable system of international trade based on just prices for exports. For Prime Minister Bishop, a new world must be one in which, and I quote, the poor of the world would at last obtain social, economic, and political justice. Grenada matters to the world. Therefore, the Grenada Revolution occurred in the context of the Cold War and the East-West ideological divide. There was US hegemony in the Caribbean basin and growing tensions in world politics. The Grenada Revolution therefore created tensions within CARICOM. And there was a concept that was coined called ideological pluralism. And when we talk about the pauses, there are two authors called Anthony Payne and Paul Sutton who came up with a typology of CARICOM: creation, conflict, pause and stagnation, and renewal and widening. And part of the pause was the ideological pluralism. Some CARICOM heads were not talking to each other over the question of Grenada. But that ability to find continuity despite change. So the establishment of the OECS in 1981 in the midst of a CARICOM on pause. So there's a relationship too between moments within the OECS and moments within CARICOM. Every time there's a long pause in CARICOM, there's a takeoff in the OECS. And if the thesis goes like this, whenever we have global challenges, there's an incentive for small states to integrate. Then the logic follows, therefore, that there is a greater incentive for smaller microstates to integrate even more. So the OECS becomes that place where Grenada could enjoy deeper forms of regionalism, even in moments when CARICOM was on pause. So that creative, disruptive role became important. The renewal role became very important too. So we have a foundation role, a creative, disruptive role, and a renewal role. And what am I calling the renewal role? In 1989, it was here in Grand Dance that CARICOM heads of government decided, among other things, to establish the CARICOM single market and economy in the shortest possible time. Every time we speak about the CSME, we have to speak about the Grand Dance Declaration of 1989. This is where Grenada stamped its image on contemporary regionalism, with the Grand Dance Declaration of 1979. So as we think about Grenada and CARICOM, we also have to frame it within the context of crisis, solidarity, and integration. And integration here being formal integration and informal integration. Now, in 1972, the then 4 leaders of CARICOM established diplomatic relations with Cuba. And what we enjoy today, as we have CARICOM Day on July 4th, and I wish to see that declared as a national holiday in every CARICOM country. And we have Cuba Day, Cuba CARICOM Day on December 8th. And it's important that solidarity. And what has Grenada brought to that story? The Grenada-Cuba relationship over time has strengthened and deepened. We've had cooperation in sports, in health diplomacy, and there's a lot that we have gained mutually in terms of our relationship with Cuba. Now, during the revolutionary period, even as we know that there were tensions, there was deep solidarity among the Caribbean left. And that became very important for a model where Caribbean people, through conferences, through people-to-people connectivity, through volunteerism. We saw many of the teachers I had in the Anglican high school were from Jamaica and Guyana and so forth and so on. We saw that kind of volunteerism, not just in Grenada, but in terms of the solidarity across the Caribbean and indeed the Black world. If we're talking about crisis and solidarity and integration, Grenada presents a best-case scenario in terms of rebuilding after Hurricane Ivan. What we saw many Grenadian students like yourselves who were about to write CXC subjects were hosted in different CARICOM countries. Sometimes we have forgotten that. So some of my Barbadian students used to say, oh, you know, we had a Grenadian student living with us. Yes, many Caribbean homes took in Grenadian students during Hurricane Ivan. That was integration at work. That was meaningful people-to-people integration. We saw informal organizations, whether it was cable and wireless, whether it was the water commissions, whether it was other organizations in the Caribbean, that came to Grenada and assisted families. And a lot happened in terms of not just the state-to-state interactions after Hurricane Ivan, but the people-to-people connectivity. And Aaron was saying it earlier, in moments of crises, it's where our best Caribbean selves shine forth. And Grenada becomes a very good case study for how Caribbean integration is at work in moments of crisis. During COVID-19 as well, and we heard about the institutions and how important the institutions were, whether it's CAFA, yes, the RSS, very important, the RSS, the Regional Security System. And these institutions have really sustained regionalism, and Grenada has indeed benefited quite a lot from functional cooperation and social and community development in CARICOM. Now, to bring it all together, there's some unfinished business. Even as we celebrate, even as we commemorate, there is some unfinished business. I spoke earlier about what I call the 4 Ps model of CARICOM. It's prime ministerial, it's piecemeal, it's paper-based, and it's people-less. When we think about our own governance model within Grenada, there's a lot more we can do to enhance our democratic processes. There are communications deficits, there are participation deficits, we have implementation deficits, we have democratic deficits. The question of completing the CCJ in its appellant jurisdiction is an unfinished business. And it's important as we go forward to think of what can we do better to strengthen what we have as a Caribbean community. Some challenges going forward, I would summarize these challenges in one word: security. When we think about CARICOM, and we know we started with 3 main objectives, economic integration through a common market, functional cooperation, and foreign policy coordination. In 2010, CARICOM added a fourth objective, which is security cooperation, through the establishment of IMPACTS, that's CARICOM Implementing Agency for Crime and Security. Now, when we see our reality in Grenada today and throughout the Caribbean, crime, climate change, food security, health security, there are so many multidimensional security threats that confront us. As we think about the prospects going forward, as we think about the next 50 years, there is no way, as a small island developing state, that we can dare think about going forward without being part of a collective resilience to build collective sustainability. We have to ensure that we strengthen our democratic processes, and we have to ensure that we institutionalize much more deeply our Caribbean, the accomplishments, let me say it this way, the accomplishments that have been achieved, we want to celebrate. We want to be able to ensure that for the next 50 years, we deepen our commitment to the Caribbean community, and we deepen our commitment to our own Grenadian identity, because as I said earlier, the Caribbean community is but a summation of its unique individual parts. And Grenada happens to be a very important slice, a spicy slice at that, of our larger Caribbean story. And I would end here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grenade, for such an inspiring presentation. I must say, the lively presentation and so in-depth, connecting all the dots way back, to now, and looking at how CARICOM even can get better at what it is now to affect the lives of our people. And it's a good time to invite Mr. Ali Gill, who will look at Caribbean integration, an indispensable necessity for the 21st century, so moving beyond. And he's online. Mr. Ali Gill is an attorney at law, cultural critic, and social and political commentator. He is a former Minister of Culture in Grenada and is currently the chair of the Grenada National Reparations Commission. Mr. Gill served as a magistrate in the Commonwealth of Dominica and as Grenada's most recent ambassador to CARICOM. Attorney Gill is a graduate of the University of the West Indies and the Hugh Wooding Law School, and holds a Master of Law degree in Maritime Studies from the Maritime Law Institute in Malta, and a Master of Business Administration from DeVry University in the United States. So I now present to you Mr. Ali N. Salimbi Gill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and warm and fraternal greetings to all of the students in particular who are present at this very important session. And allow me, before I begin my presentation, to commend the organizers of this session who have seen it fit to make TAMCC, T.A. Marshall Community College, the host of this evening's roundtable discussion. And it will be remiss of me if I fail to congratulate my very good friend, acting principal, Mr. Telesford, on his recent elevation. And I will say to Mr. Telesford that this should be the first of many in a series of live lectures and public discussions at the TAMCC. I recall my days at the TAMCC, we used to have live discussions, and I hope yourself and your colleague next to you, who is a well-known and respected writer, will see it fit to continue these sessions. So we do not have to wait until the Independence Committee asks the TAMCC to host such a session, but TAMCC will now lead as our premier indigenous institution. And in that light, we could not have hoped, because Theophilus Albert Marisho was the ideologue of West Indies Federation. In fact, if we were to contextualize the Federation his newspaper was called the West Indian. And the motto of his newspaper was the West Indies must be West Indian. And T.A. Marichaud used that newspaper to promote the ideas, promote the philosophy of a West Indian Federation. And as such, we could not have been in a better place, in a better space to have this discussion this evening. But before I venture into the specific topic that I was asked to lead on, it will be remiss of me if I do not also comment, as Ambassador Moses did and Dr. Grenade spoke earlier on, with regards to the efforts which was made before CARICOM, before 1973, to have this CARICOM movement, this CARICOM integration. Indeed, the first settlers, or Kalinagos or Araks and so on, these early peoples understood the ideas and philosophies of Caribbean integration. In fact, St. Vincent was the headquarters for the Kalinago civilization in the southern part of the Caribbean. And that they traversed the islands using their canoes and so on, and they would have had conferences and assemblies and so on particular islands. In fact, the story is told that in Barbados, when the British got there, they met empty houses, thousands of empty houses, and no inhabitants. And the history is that these inhabitants moved from Barbados and went to St. Vincent in the early days. But so that this movement of Caribbean integration is not yesterday that we've been trying to integrate ourselves and to live and to survive as a people. One other thing, it is extremely important that we contextualize the West Indies Federation 1958 to 1962. The West Indian Federation was a federation of British colonies. At this particular point in time in our history, all of the countries in the Caribbean from 1954, they were essentially colonies. So that while we have repeatedly speak to the failures of the failure of the British, of the West Indian Federation, and Dr. Grenade astutely pointed out that she do not consider it a failure because 1 from 10 leaves 9, and that is the number for the OECS countries. I believe that we must lay blame where blame ought to be rightly laid. What we had with regards to the West Indian Federation was a British setup. The British government, while Dr. Grenade pointed out at the time that they were joining the European Union and they were getting closer to other European countries, these British colonies, when they embarked upon West Indian Federation, no resources, financial resources, were made available to them by the British government, although they were colonies. So what we had was a situation where resources of Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Grenada, and so on, which, if you read the Moyne Commission and so on, you will see the social crisis and the poverty and the underdevelopment of these islands at the time. Now with the West Indian Federation, these leaders, Bustamante, Eric Williams, and so on, they now had to use these resources, not only for their own issues, independent of the federation. In other words, the national issues of development in terms of developing infrastructure, providing health facilities and healthcare, educational facilities, and educational services, and so on in the individual countries. They also now had to share these resources with regards to the governance of the West Indian Federation. And that, to my mind, placed the greatest strain on the West Indian Federation movement of 1958, so that while one do concede that the leaders Bustamante in Jamaica, Eric Williams in Trinidad, and so had their own opinions, had their own struggles with regards to caring for their own political survival in their own territories. And at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that these islands were all battling for independence at the time. We have to appreciate the role which was played by the British in terms of not making resources available for the survival of West Indian Federation. And of course, it is my respectful view that that placed a great burden and strain on the integration movement at the time, which we all knew that in 1962 it met its demise. Caribbean integration, an indispensable necessity for the 21st century. Now, Dr. David Rudder, when he sang in his fourth verse, Rally Around the West Indies, he made one quintessential point, which to my mind ground all of the discussions that we're having here this afternoon on CARICOM. He sang, "In a divided world that don't need islands no more." That, to my mind, contextualizes the need for CARICOM and Caribbean integration. And let me ground this by looking at what it is that we speak of CARICOM. 15 member states, 5 associate states, an average population of 18 million people. That is what we speak of when we speak of CARICOM. 18 million people on average. The largest population block comes from Haiti, an average of about 11.5 million. Yes? Trinidad and Tobago, what, 1.5 million or thereabouts? Jamaica, 2.8 million. Grenada, 110,000 or thereabouts. Now, let us compare that with the European Union. And Dr. Grenada already pointed out that this CARICOM movement is the first of its kind in the world, basically. But the European Union have a population of some 448.4 million people or thereabouts. You're talking about the largest nation of Germany, having 83 million. France, 64.7 million. And we can continue to do the breakdown. You can Google it. The point I'm making is that when you compare the population size of the CARICOM region with that of the rest of the world, the United States is what, over 330 million. And Ambassador Moses spoke with regards to economies of scale, the production of goods and services, the sale of goods and services. We must ask ourselves in the 21st century, how can we compete? How can we survive? And I will borrow and give credit to Dr. Grenade with regards to the word survivability. Now here it is. Consider a CARICOM region, 18 million people, and look at the other major countries in the world, and look at the size of the economy, the size of the populations. Grenada, as an independent state, we are celebrating 50 years. But our population is 100,000, 110,000. And every time we speak of agriculture, the exportation of spices, nutmegs, cocoa, and so on and so forth, and we look at our competitors, and we speak of the quality of our produce and so on and so forth. But as other panelists have spoken before, with regards to the size that Grenada is, the size in which the Caribbean is, even at 18 million, we're extremely small in the grand scheme of things. And CARICOM has provided us not just with a market, because CSME and the common market that is, to my mind, the major setup of CARICOM has, the Caribbean single market, has provided us with this market. But more than that, it has given us a greater voice for competitiveness, a greater voice on the international scene. And Ambassador Moses spoke with regards to the challenges that we have with regards to foreign affairs. We do have challenges in the sense that when it comes for us to have a common foreign policy, oftentimes all the islands of CARICOM do not agree on how we vote at the United Nations or what foreign policy position we adopt on any particular issue. It could be the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It can be the Ukraine war. It can be on a whole host of different issues. However, history has shown that when we have agreed on a particular position, the world takes note. And CARICOM is responsible for removing Cuba, for instance, from international isolation. The founders of CARICOM recognized Cuba, the government of Cuba, in 1973-74. Now let us look at when we speak of the necessity of CARICOM in the 21st century, we'll appreciate that as the world continues to be interconnected, Caribbean countries growingly find themselves competing among ourselves. So that competing as a single competitive space gives us a better limb to stand on with regards to competition. Now let me ground this in this particular way. We spoke, two of our presenters already spoke about CAFA and the role CAFA played during the COVID period and the RSS. Now just to ground it in a more and bring home the point. Now in the early days of COVID, what we had in the Caribbean was the RSS plane, which is like a small cargo plane, was going through the Caribbean islands, Eastern Caribbean islands, picking up samples that our health professionals would have taken from patients to bring it to test in one center within the Caribbean. Yes, so that is what, before Grenada, Antigua, St. Vincent, and so on, were doing the COVID test on island. What we had was that the efforts of CAFA, we were using one center to test for the COVID. Until later on, we developed the capacity for every island to test for COVID. Secondly, during COVID again, in terms of purchasing medicine, purchasing what we call it now, all of us had the injections, it was because of the efforts of CAFA and CARICOM in purchasing the medication in block and dividing it among Caribbean countries. One, we were able to get it cheaper. Two, we were able to, with one agency, purchase or receive what keep eluding me now? The shots with regards to COVID. So we had one voice, and that continues on a daily basis. Now, one of the reasons we have a lot of criticisms of CARICOM is because, one, CARICOM, the public education of what CARICOM actually do on a daily basis is not known to the common man. so that when we experience challenges in terms of inter-Caribbean travel, when we experience public fallouts on foreign policy positions and so on, for us to say, look at CARICOM again, we are not achieving anything. But little do they know that in terms of health, the Caribbean has made tremendous strides. Tremendous strides. And Senator Moses spoke with regards to CXC and education. And I do not want to rehash that. Now, what I want to go into now is this new initiative in CARICOM, 25 by 25. Now, CARICOM heads have recognized that our food import bill is crippling our economies. We import millions and millions of dollars every year across the region in terms of meat, poultry, eggs, you name it, vegetables, you name it. Now, what is happening now is that through CARICOM, President Ofan Ali of Guyana, who is the lead head agriculture and agricultural processing and so on, the initiative now is to reduce the importation of agricultural, the importation of agricultural products by some 25% by the year 2025. What that means now is that Guyana and Suriname, for instance, that have large acreages of land, they are leading now with regards to the production of livestock. So that if students were to Google the Barbados Suriname initiative, Barbados Guyana initiative, for instance, with the black belly sheep, black belly sheep from Barbados is sent to Guyana, for instance, for purposes of crossbreeding and rearing, with the purpose of which is that with the crossbreeding and rearing, Guyana, with the large tracts of land, with greater availability for feed, will be able to now mass produce black belly sheep and be able to sell it not just to Barbados, but the rest of the region. So within CARICOM, we'll be able to be more self-sufficient in terms of mutton. That initiative as well would go for beef, poultry, eggs, and so on and so forth. It also extends to certain food crops, vegetables, cassava, and so on and so forth. So that initiative, the year 2025, we are going to see how much we will succeed. Would we meet our target of 25%? Would we reach 20%? Would we reach 17%? But the fact of the matter is that this is a CARICOM initiative now that deals with the issue of food security within the CARICOM region, and is a practical way of resolving this issue. And that is why we speak, and that is why we say that CARICOM now in the 21st century is more relevant than even before, as we look towards food security. The issue of climate security, I do not have to speak at great lengths with regards to the issue of the climate crisis. As I understand it, a student from the TAMCC was at the last meeting dealing with the issue of climate change. We need to ask ourselves, would Grenada standing by itself will have a louder voice, a more powerful voice than Grenada standing alongside other CARICOM countries, saying the same thing that other CARICOM countries are saying, and with one voice on the issue of climate change on the world stage. This is what we are speaking about in terms of CARICOM and the relevance of CARICOM in the 21st century. Now, we need to understand, students need to understand, that CARICOM is not a supra-regional institution. It is not an institution whereby the CARICOM Secretariat sits in Georgetown, Guyana, and make decisions that every CARICOM country must simply follow. It is an intra-integration setup, meaning that CARICOM heads have to agree with regards to decision-making and implementation. And yes, we've had challenges, especially with regards to implementation over the years. We've had these challenges, and I think Dr. Grenade spoke eloquently on this issue of challenges, as well as Ambassador Moses. However, when we look at the entire picture, we look at the whole picture, so to speak, I believe that it can be fairly concluded that the benefits of CARICOM, the advantages of CARICOM, for us as small developing nations in the 21st century, far outweighs any of the challenges that we presently face. Indeed, as we continue to face these challenges, in particular of implementation, outgoing chairman of CARICOM, Prime Minister Skerrit of Dominica, in his end-of-year address, spoke to the issue of free movement of CARICOM nationals, hassle-free travel. Hopefully, if that can be implemented this year, this will go some way in convincing the ordinary Caribbean man and woman that CARICOM is working. But the issue of free movement of travel, the issue of Caribbean nationals working in different countries, Caribbean businesses are set up in different countries, all these realities go some way in developing our economies, creating employment, and benefiting our people. And I am of the respectful view that CARICOM can only go from strength to strength with regards to delivering to the ordinary man and woman in the region, and the relevance of CARICOM as we go forward in the 21st century continues to impact purposefully the lives of our Caribbean people. I will end here. Thank you so much.
Gil, for your presentation. Thank you for moving forward with the Caribbean integration. It's a necessity for us to continue this Caribbean unity. We are very much out of time with regards to our discussion here this afternoon. So we'll move straight into the visual rendering of the Roundabout, and we'll turn you over to Mr. Ms. Gail Purcell.
Good afternoon. All right, you can hear me now. Well, we've had, I think, a lot of information, and I think very good information, food for thought. I'm sure it's been new for many of our young people in the audience today, but I'm certain also it's been informative and that you've taken a lot away in a context probably different than you would normally learn in your classroom. And certainly you're better positioned now to write that paper whenever it comes along and to answer the question whenever, and your SBAs certainly puts you in an advantageous position. So I certainly hope you've consumed and absorbed as much of it as possible, and taking it further than just our discussion and dialogue today, but starting to look at it in the context of your lives and how CARICOM really does have an impact. So that brings us to part of the reason we're here today, which is the unveiling of the rendering of the proposed design for the roundabout. So what I'm about to present my panel is at a disadvantage because they can't see. What I'm about to present is the initial proposed design for the roundabout. However, following our consultations and feedback from the public, we have decided to involve the public further in the design process. So the final decision, this is a rendering that we're proposing, will be selected in March, with the roundabout's completion scheduled for July. We've also identified 2 potential locations for the roundabout, Upper Lothers Lane and the Trubu roundabout, and the final location will also be put for further public discussion and selection. So this initial design, which should be on your screen, this initial design for the CARICOM roundabout is a powerful symbol of Grenada's enduring commitment to regional integration and development, marking 5 decades of contribution to the Caribbean community. It stands as a testament to unity and collective growth, not only for Grenada, but for the entire region. At the heart of this magnificent roundabout stands a central flagpole. This flagpole proudly flies the Grenada flag year-round. During special CARICOM or regional related events on the island, it gracefully transitions to the CARICOM flag, signifying the region's shared purpose and cooperation. Encircling the central flagpole are 20 medium-height pillars, each standing at approximately 4 feet tall. These pillars represent the 20 CARICOM states that make up the Caribbean community. Each pillar will bear the engraved names of the respective country. As daylight fades and the sun sets below the horizon, the roundabout undergoes a captivating transformation. Each pillar comes to life as the engraved names are illuminated, casting a spellbinding display that enchants passerbys during the tranquil night hours. The roundabout's landscaping will add an additional layer of elegance to the roundabout. The meticulous care is given to every detail, including the strategic placement of graceful trees, expertly tendered hedges, and vibrant array of flowers. In essence, the CARICOM roundabout transcends its role as a mere intersection. It stands as a dynamic embodiment of CARICOM unity, celebrating Grenada's half-century commitment to the region and the shared values that bind the nation of the Caribbean together. It is a visual testament to the enduring strength and unity of the Caribbean community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gail Purcell, for rendering the visual roundabout, right? The visual rendering of the roundabout. Thank you very much. I think it will start a discussion throughout the country. People are going to share their views on it, and we hope to get a good, something good out of it eventually. So we'd like to say thanks to all of you for turning out to this panel discussion, which I think was a very informative one, and so much information of our history that have really defined who we are as a people. So to the students and those who participated online and those who gathered here, we thank you for joining us. To Dr. John Telesford, Acting Principal of T.A. Marshall Community College, and his colleagues and the staff of the college for hosting us here. Thank you very much. Dr. Wendy Crawford and her team for planning this discussion and the rest of the activities for the 50th anniversary. We thank you very much for your initiative. To Honorable Joseph Andel for his remarks at the beginning of the session. Our panelists, Dr. Curtis Jacobs, who spoke on the role of Grenadian T.A. Marshall in shaping the early integration. Thank you, sir, for your presentation. Mr. Aaron Moses, Economic Integration, Reflections and Perspectives. Again, we thank you for your presentation on the theme. And Dr. Wendy Grenade, Grenada CARICOM Journey, Reflections and Perspective. Again, another inspiring presentation. I'm particularly interested in the 4 Ps. I would like to hear more about that later on. Yeah. Mr. Ali Gill, Caribbean Integration, an Indispensable Necessity for the 21st Century. Thank you very much for your presentation and enlightening us. And to GIS and the media, we thank you for sharing the information around. I know persons have been, people have been viewing in different parts of the world. And we had some questions as well, but because of time, we couldn't get into it. But we say thank you, GIS and the team, and for bringing it online. Thank you very much. And do have yourself a wonderful day.